In the summer of 1896, New York City ran out of ice, ran out of coffins, and ran out of time. In 10 days, more than 1,000 people were dead. Not from a disease, not from a war, from the air itself. Families dragged their mattresses onto rooftops and fire escapes just to breathe. Horses dropped dead in the streets pulling carriages. And the people who could have been saved by one simple machine didn't have it yet, because it hadn't been invented. This is the story of that machine. A machine so small, so unglamorous, that most people forget it exists at all, the electric fan. Before air conditioning ever touched a single American home, the fan was the only thing standing between a city and a body count. And the man who built it never got to see what it became. Here's what nobody tells you about American cities before the 1880s. They were built to trap heat, not survive it. Brick and stone tenements packed shoulder to shoulder. No trees, no breeze. Iron roofs that turned top-floor apartments into ovens by 10 a.m. And heat wasn't just uncomfortable back then, it was a class problem. If you were rich, you left. Entire families abandoned the city every July for the mountains or the coast for months at a time. If you were poor, you stayed, packed into a 5-story walk-up with no windows on 2 sides, and you prayed. The 1896 heat wave wasn't even the worst one. It just happened to be the one a young police commissioner in New York was watching closely. A man named Theodore Roosevelt, who ordered ice distributed to the tenements for free because there was nothing else the city could do. Doctors at the time didn't even have a real name for what was killing people. They called it sunstroke and shrugged. Nobody understood yet that it wasn't the sun. It was stagnant, unmoving air, trapping heat against the human body with nowhere to go. What the world needed wasn't a stronger sun umbrella or a better icebox. It needed movement, air that pushed back. In 1882, a 22-year-old engineer named Schuyler Scarts Wheeler was working for an electric motor company in New York, tinkering with small motors that were, at the time, mostly used for sewing machines and printing presses. Wheeler wasn't trying to save anyone. He was bored and he had spare parts. He took one of those tiny motors, bolted 2 blades onto it and plugged it in. No cage around the blades, no oscillation, no speed settings, just a spinning propeller on a stick, sitting on a desk, pushing air in one direction. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like the future. It looked like a toy a bored engineer built on a slow afternoon. And for years, that's basically all it was. Wheeler's fan showed up in the offices of the wealthy and in a handful of fancy department stores as a novelty, a curiosity people paid to look at more than to use. Here's the detail almost nobody mentions. Wheeler never patented improvements on his own invention, and he barely profited from it. He went on to a long career in electrical engineering, became a president of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers decades later, and the fan that would end up saving thousands of lives during heat waves, he never got a dime of royalties for beyond that first sale. The man who built one of the most quietly important machines of the century is barely a footnote in his own invention story. So how did a desk novelty become the thing standing between a city and mass casualties? Money and heat-related lawsuits. By the 1890s, American factories were losing workers to heat exhaustion on the factory floor, and that was cutting into production. Factory owners didn't install fans out of compassion. They installed them because a worker who fainted at 2 p.m. was a worker who wasn't making product. The electric fan became standard equipment in mills and factories, not because it was kind, but because it was cheap and it worked. Then, in 1908 and 1909, the Emerson Electric Company took Wheeler's basic idea and gave it 2 upgrades that changed everything. Oscillation, so the fan swept air across an entire room instead of one narrow blast, and safety cages, so factory workers stopped losing fingers. Prices dropped as mass production kicked in. By the 1920s, a fan that had once been a curiosity for the wealthy cost about what a week's groceries cost for a working family, and that's the moment the fan stopped being a novelty and became infrastructure. It showed up in tenement windows, in corner stores, propped in doorways of movie theaters to lure customers in off the street with the promise of cooled air inside, years before real mechanical air conditioning ever reached those same buildings. By the time the next major heat wave hit American cities, hundreds of thousands of homes had a fan running. It wasn't a solution, but it was something, and something was more than the 1890s ever had. Here's the part of the story that turns dark, and it's the part almost nobody talks about. The electric fan gave people something dangerous: false confidence. In July 1936, one of the most brutal heat waves in North American history swept across the United States and Canada. Temperatures in some cities hit and passed 110 degrees Fahrenheit for days on end. And by the time it broke, more than 5,000 people were dead across the continent, making it to this day one of the deadliest weather events in American history. Worse than most hurricanes, worse than most tornado outbreaks, and in a huge number of those deaths, a fan was running the entire time. Here's the brutal physics nobody explained to people in 1936. A fan does not cool air, it moves air. Below a certain temperature threshold, moving air across your skin helps sweat evaporate and genuinely cools your body. But above roughly 95 degrees Fahrenheit, especially with high humidity, a fan blowing hot air across your skin can push your body temperature up faster, not down. People sat directly in front of running fans in rooms well past that threshold, and their bodies overheated anyway because the sensation of a breeze felt like relief even when it was doing nothing, or worse than nothing. There's a specific cruelty to that. The machine that was supposed to be the answer became, in the worst heat waves, part of the problem, not because it failed, but because people trusted it completely and nobody had told them where its limits were. And there's another cost buried in this story that almost never gets told. In colonial India, under British rule, entire households depended on a human profession called the punkah wala, a servant, often a child, who sat for hours pulling a rope attached to a giant cloth fan hanging from the ceiling, keeping wealthy households cool through unbearable heat. It was exhausting, underpaid, often inherited work passed down through families for generations. When electric ceiling fans arrived in India in the early 20th century, they didn't just cool rooms faster, they erased an entire profession almost overnight, and with it, the livelihood of thousands of people who had no other trade to fall back on. The machine that saved some lives quietly ended the only income other people had. The real answer to the heat wasn't a fan at all. It was a 25-year-old engineer named Willis Carrier who in 1902 was hired to solve a completely different problem. A Brooklyn printing company's paper kept warping because of humidity, ruining their color printing. Carrier's fix, cooling and controlling the moisture in the air itself, became the blueprint for what we now call air conditioning. So for roughly 70 years, from Wheeler's toy in 1882 to affordable home air conditioning in the 1960s, the electric fan was the only line of defense an ordinary family had. Not a perfect one. Sometimes, as we just saw, a dangerous one. But the only one. Here's the twist this story ends on. Air conditioning won. It conquered the South. Next time a fan is running in the corner of a room, doing a job so boring nobody even notices it, remember what it replaced. Bodies on rooftops, ice wagons racing through tenement streets, a death toll nobody wanted to count. It's not glamorous, it never was. That's exactly why its story got buried. If you want more machines and objects that quietly reshaped how people survive, the stuff that never makes it into the history books, Dustborn exists to dig those stories up. Subscribe because the next forgotten history that saved a life is one click away.